Thank you so much. Thank you, Paul and David, for having me. Thank you, everyone, for braving Webex, which is a uniquely difficult platform. But hopefully the security will be worth it. Oh, wait, so just a quick announcement to make sure that you've muted yourself. Otherwise, I get a little fuzzy. Otherwise, thank you very much for being here at whatever hour of the day it is for you, whatever in the world you are. So this talk is a work in progress in the sense that it can build on previous reflections that I've written and talked about, but it remains fairly what it's progressing towards. And that's really looking forward to conversation. I wanted to save time for Q&A and have a conversation and to your thoughts as well. That's important to me. It's also a part of a project that's taken me a bit by surprise, I have to admit. I had no plans necessarily to write about the Hong Kong protests prior to around November 2019. Though I'd been attending them. And I'd been preoccupied actually with the concurrent protests and police action in India, first in Kashmir and then in Assam and then nationwide. And I just finished a book on South Asian anti-colonial revolutionary protests, and I'd been expecting to use last fall to start a book about my great uncle and AIDS protests and activism in the US in the 1990s. So in short, I had planned to write about protest and revolution in the past, but ended up writing about protest and revolution in the present. The following reflections, I think it will be clear about the ongoing protests are partial. They're more theoretical than they are descriptive. It will be clear that I'm biased, even though if I have any conclusions, those will express, I think, a deep ambivalence, and I'm eager to hear what you think. I've talked with student protesters, bankers, journalists. In the fall, I attended protests and skirmishes, and I remain on a lot of encrypted group chats. I should say, for reasons that will become clear, that I have in no way interfered with protesters' actions. And what I've done, in case you're interested, is maintain a list of sources that I've found particularly valuable, and I've posted them on my website so you can kind of see the sources that I'm relying on from local journalists and writers, thinkers in English and Cantonese, and that I recommend them strongly. So I began writing about the Hong Kong protests in response to the critique that the protesters, that I heard quite often, that the protesters had no plans, that the so-called 5 demands were merely pragmatic, that there were kind of no political philosophy undergirding the protests. This critique caught my attention because it is nearly identical to the responses to South Asian anti-colonialism in the early 20th century, which is where I spend most of my time. Merely pragmatic has been the excuse for not taking anti-colonial thought seriously, even though most 20th century anti-colonial thought across the 20th century, across the global South, presents an extraordinarily vibrant theory for a world after colonialism, written in the midst of a world completely determined by it. The Hong Kong protests are no different. Just like any political movement, there is no one philosophy that unifies the revolutionary project. The pro-Hong Kong movement is composed of multiple competing and opposing visions across the political spectrum for what Hong Kong might become. For now, I think that's precisely the point. So what I want to do here is to offer an analysis of the ongoing protests that places them within a trajectory of revolutionary and anti-colonial activism across the 20th century, and then outlines the contours of a kind of impossible political theory that I think that they present. To refresh our memories, it has been quite a year. Here's a crash course timeline. The Hong Kong protests began in spring 2019 when Chief Executive Carrie Lam proposed a bill that would allow extradition to the PRC from Hong Kong. She has since revoked the bill, but by that point, the protests had grown from 1 demand to 5. Protests follow up on the shorter-lived umbrella movement or revolution protests from 2014, which were a response to the dwindling autonomy of Hong Kong from the PRC, an erosion that began, given any one of the dates that you might choose, 1984, 1997, 2003, but certainly in earnest by 2008. There's no simple way of describing the protests sociologically, which have varied in size and intensity especially since June 2019. The protesters themselves sort of tend to be younger rather than older, tend to be more middle class than elite, tend to be more ethnically Chinese, Cantonese speaking than not, but none of these are any useful predictors of who is participating or supporting the movement. The differences between each protest have had less to do with the protesters themselves and more to do with the wildly disproportionate response from the Hong Kong police, who face, it appears, no consequences from their extraordinarily violent behavior. There are no riots, and that being a very kind of controversial term, there are no riots except for the riot police. The protests have not stopped since June 2019, though their physical presence on the streets in Hong Kong was, of course, muted during the coronavirus pandemic, which Hong Kong experienced most severely between late January and mid-March. Hong Kong has had only a few cases since in the past 2 months at this point. The city government has arbitrarily used social distancing regulations to shut down assemblies, and including Tiananmen Square massacre memorials on Thursday, and the ban on public assemblies now extends until June 18th. In mid-May, Hong Kong's Legislative Council announced that it would discuss criminalizing the vague act disrespecting the Chinese national anthem. On Friday, the 22nd of May, the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, in Beijing announced that it was drafting national security laws, and then Carrie Lam followed shortly, announcing that she would support them. The laws, though they have yet to be drafted, presumably criminalize the ill-defined acts of subversion, sedition, accepting foreign interference, and terrorism. The bill passed in Beijing last Thursday. As I said, the specifics of the national security bill are mostly unknown, including by legislators in Hong Kong. But the national security bill effectively voids the already tenuous claim that Hong Kong is a special autonomous administrative region or autonomous region with a high degree of judicial and legislative autonomy from the PRC. The Hong Kong Bar Association has declared these laws from Beijing unconstitutional. The laws are certainly a direct violation of the Sino-British Joint Declaration of 1984, which purported to ensure one nation, two systems, a structure that would presumably be in place until 2047. Hong Kong's legal structure does allow for Hong Kong to enact its own security laws under Basic Law Article 23, but Beijing's bill overrides Hong Kong's judicial system and places the city under presumably direct rule from the PRC CCP. If you're interested in the details of the kind of legal details of this, I strongly recommend the work of a lot of legal scholars who are in the law school at the University of Hong Kong and have written kind of extensively about this. Implementation of Beijing's national security laws is expected to begin no later than September. There have been major protests and indiscriminate use of police force since then. On Wednesday, 27 May, 360 people were arrested for assembling illegally, and many were under the age of 18. The EU, the UK, and the US have issued warnings of sanctions against the PRC, though it's unclear what weight those would carry. Carrie Lam's justification for the national security laws is that they aren't essentially different than anti-terrorism laws on the books in Europe and the US. Even if this is the case, which Lam could not possibly know as she has not seen any documents from Beijing, it is a lousy excuse. The implementation of security and anti-terrorism legislation around the world has already proven to be deplorable, and such legislation has disproportionately targeted certain religious and ethnic minorities, and it has produced, in many cases, more terror than security. The protest chants in the fall, 5 demands, not one less, liberate Hong Kong, the revolution of our times, fight for freedom, stand with Hong Kong, have since been complemented by more overt calls for Hong Kong's total independence. Pro-democracy and pro-Beijing, the kind of two camps that had been one way of separating out political distinctions in the fall elections, are kind of only partially helpful and descriptive, and they both contain a wide range of political positions. But within the pro-democracy camp, there are ongoing debates about the goals, tactics, meanings, and uses of revolution, as well as the perpetual battle for the definition of what Hong Kong is or might be. There's much to say about the protest chant, "Liberate Hong Kong, the revolution of our times," from its troubling resonances with earlier xenophobic nationalist slogans, the many meanings and translations of liberation. Otherwise, liberate might be an appropriate word for an island that stands at the center of liberalism. In Chinese, the phrase is a little less clear. Is this a demand for a liberation from something and therefore kind of future-oriented? Or is it a restoration to something and therefore facing backwards as something like a return to a glorious past? It might be both. Now, an increasingly popular chant is Hong Kong independence, the only way out. The demand for full Hong Kong independence is now a demand with, in fact, widespread appeal, rather than the relatively marginal position it occupied within the pro-democracy coalition leading up to about May 2020. Liberation as a way out, or as the only way out, is a different orientation. In this framing, to revolt is to leave, to exit. The frame revolution in terms of leaving is to participate, I think, in a really vibrant anti-colonial tradition. This was, in fact, the same as Frantz Fanon's breathtaking call at the end of The Wretched of the Earth in 1961, where he says, this is a quote, "Now, comrades, let us leave this Europe, which never stops talking of man, yet massacres him at every one of its street corners, at every corner in the world." Fanon's call is to his Algerian comrades is to find a way out from Europe's control. Fanon is primarily addressing his comrades in Algeria who were demanding an end to French colonial occupation there. It is, I think, at first glance, counterintuitive. Why should Fanon's Algerian comrades leave rather than the French? Obviously, a demand for independence in Hong Kong requires, in the first instance, that the PRC leave. But a demand for Hong Kong independence on Hong Kong terms, like Fanon's demand for Algerian independence on Algerian terms, cannot simply be about the absence of the colonial power. There are plenty of other people, countries, or financial institutions keen to take their place. Protection allegedly proffered by other empires comes at a steep cost. Ask Puerto Rico. A revolutionary and anti-colonial exit strategy for Hong Kong, as well as for Fanon, is the attempt to reach a world beyond the confines of the dismal options presented in this one. Fanon's call to leave this world has two additional demands in the conclusion to The Wretched of the Earth. The first is to face the likelihood of extraordinary violence and, quote, total annihilation. The second is to simultaneously endeavor to create a new world from the wretched of the earth. I think these kind of paradoxical claims have corollaries in Hong Kong, where chants of "till my last breath, revolt and fight" can be heard alongside "Hong Kongers, build your nation." These have to be thought together rather than, I think, as contradictory. What sort of revolution this looks like is difficult to imagine, but that might speak more to the ways in which our times have limited the range of recognized forms of political belonging. A plea for revolutionary political autonomy is not a request to join a different empire, and that we still find ourselves stuck in this way of thinking is a clear sign that the Cold War rages on. Writers and thinkers for the leftist Hong Kong journal Al Sun, which I highly recommend reading, have repeatedly written that Hong Kong's revolution is for, quote, a liberation from the ossified categories of nation, state, sovereignty, and so on that have previously bordered our imagination. This is why analyses that pit liberalism against communism, East against West, democracy against repression, and so on tend to be, or in fact, absurd and vacuous. I'm slightly sympathetic to the analyses that situate Hong Kong as a site for a proxy war between the US and the PRC, but this constantly runs the risk of rendering Hong Kong an abstract metaphor at the expense of the 7 million actual people who live here. It is not clear in any case that there are substantial differences between the US and the PRC at this point. Both nations have imperial aspirations, which are simultaneously expansionist and xenophobic, and both have heads of state whose authoritarian desires are made doubly dangerous by hubristic short-sightedness. There are a few differences between capitalism with Chinese characteristics and capitalism with Western characteristics, and in any case, the two capitalisms have worked fine together in open partnership for at least 30 years. The benefactors of Hong Kong's current deregulated liberal capitalism will be the same benefactors of the CCP's party-regulated capitalism if they already aren't. The majority of Hong Kong citizens clearly don't want Hong Kong to be part of the PRC, but it doesn't follow that they want the city to be beholden to Europe or to the US. But quite simply and somewhat obviously, Hong Kong citizens want Hong Kong to be Hong Kong. This is why revolutionary Hong Kong is the only way out, the way out. With few exceptions, pro-Hong Kong activists and thinkers have insisted that, quote, what Hong Kong is, or what it should be, must remain an open question rather than a definitive answer. This has been a crisis of identity, to be sure, for at least since the 1990s, but settling it has been more dangerous than leaving it open. Wilfred Chan, writing in response to the national security laws last week, issued a powerful eulogy for, quote, the open question that Hong Kong has always posed. In its place now, Chan wrote, was China's apparent answer. Although I think it's correct to place Hong Kong protests in a genealogy of robust anti-colonial thought and activism, it's a less straightforward project to square it with standard colonial analyses. That it was a colonial holding, if not a colonial invention of the British, is certainly true. That it had, until last week, some degree of post-colonial autonomy is true. That it is a colonial holding of the PRC now is certainly true. And yet, all of these, I think, are ultimately insufficient ways of framing the status of Hong Kong. British rule over Hong Kong, with few exceptions, was haphazard and ultimately, I think, inept. The British Empire, as a general rule, was a largely incompetent empire. A friend noted recently that the coronavirus had finally shown the British what it's like to be ruled by the British, but it was uniquely incompetent in Hong Kong. Queen Victoria's 99-year lease on Hong Kong, signed in 1898, has to be among the most bizarre documents of imperial presumptuousness ever produced. When asked what she thought would happen in 1997, a year that she could not bring herself to imagine, Victoria allegedly replied that she had, quote, no plans of giving up what one has. After World War II, it was under British incompetence that Hong Kong thrived. It was the center of the world, the capital of capitalism. Under the conditions of imperial neglect, apathy, and ineptitude, Hong Kong cultivated a uniquely Hong Kong art, the art of being governed poorly. Hong Kong was a set of impossible combinations: liberalism without democracy, social welfare without communism, commerce without production, autonomy without sovereignty. That Hong Kong was a thriving impossibility was as emancipatory as it was confining. Hong Kong has always been a city of political activism, but it has been rarely recognized as political. Its history of political thought and activism has often been disregarded as merely pragmatic, myopically economic, and insufficiently local. Hong Kong spoke a political language of paradox and impossibility, while the global powers throughout the Cold War, the 20th century, could only hear binary opposition and realpolitik. To be clear, British imperial incompetence in Hong Kong was not benign. Governing poorly is nothing to celebrate. The British produced an especially aggressive police force and calcified severe economic and political inequality. Hong Kongers protested along the way, with especially notable strikes in 1922, 1966, and 1967. And there were a number of minor mutinies along the way in between, and plenty of disproportionate responses from the British colonial army. With the possible exception of Chris Patten, whose tenure as the last British governor of Hong Kong was largely spent covering up the empire's messes, governing Hong Kong was a practice of cultivated neglect. From this vantage, it seems only fitting that it was Margaret Thatcher who secretly negotiated and signed the Sino-British Joint Declaration with Deng Xiaoping from 1982 to 1984. Perhaps she was so exhausted from having just fought for islands off the coast of Argentina that she could not cobble up enough energy to fight for islands off the coast of China. In Thatcherite fashion, she publicly maintained that the PRC would, quote, probably leave Hong Kong alone, a position that she reiterated verbatim after the 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre. Declassified documents from Thatcher's 1982 visit to Beijing reveal that although she was, quote, seriously disturbed by her meetings with Chinese representatives, she ultimately considered Hong Kong a public entity in need of quick selling off. If India was the crown jewel of the British Empire, Hong Kong was its Grenfell Tower. Probably leave Hong Kong alone was not only Thatcher's vacuous assurance to Hong Kong denizens when she visited the city, but the perfect crystallization of Great Britain's governing policy in Hong Kong during its 99-year lease. Hong Kong was an island of financial deregulation and, quote, free labor, both a battleground and an open secret conduit between competing world powers. As the 20th century lumbered forward and decolonization movements led to national independence across the Third World, emergent empires appealed to the United Nations for a different sort of non-interference and neglect. In 1953, the US petitioned the UN to declare perpetual non-self-governing status to Puerto Rico and to revoke its ability to demand sovereignty. In 1960, Belgium and India tweaked the UN Charter to require that a post-colonial nation be separated by, quote, at least 30 miles of open ocean in order to qualify for self-determination and autonomy. And in 1972, the PRC followed the US's lead, making Hong Kong not technically eligible for national sovereignty. In other words, the US, Belgium, India, and the PRC formalized UN negligence as international law. One nation, two systems was the vague promise from the CCP that it would continue to govern Hong Kong poorly, and in a particular way, or a peculiar way, it has sort of upheld that promise until now. The threat or the fear of the CCP, especially since 1989, is that it governs exceedingly well. The CCP has proven that to be the case in its expansion westward, with Tibetans, with Uyghurs, and with political skeptics. The national security laws, although in ways yet to be specified, are likely to have a similar effect in Hong Kong. To govern well is not the same as being a good government. What we are witnessing now across the world is that those are in fact opposites. If anything, the failures of the inadequacies of the CCP will contribute just as much to making life in Hong Kong worse as its competencies and its power will. If the infamous Hong Kong protest slogan, "When we burn, you will burn with us," is a threat, it is also a resignation in reverse, which is equally likely to be true. When you burn, we will burn with you. In 2019, it was alluring to put Hong Kong protests in the context of other protests around the world, like those in Chile, Lebanon, India, France, Sudan, Spain, Algeria, and Iran. All of the protests might be connected to revolutions and protests like Arab Spring, anti-austerity protests in Europe, and anti-corruption campaigns in South Asia in the early teens. It is possible to argue that the global wave of protests reveal the state's inability to represent its people. This would be something like a crisis of democracy, for which one rightly requires pro-democracy protests. The protests in Delhi in opposition to the Citizen Amendment Act, CAA, an act that effectively strips religious and ethnic minorities of their citizenship, were one of the significant protests of 2019 that came to a sudden halt in March. Shortly before that, right-wing Hindu militias with saffron-labeled maps selectively burnt down Muslim-owned stores and homes across North Delhi. In France, protesters and yellow vests have demanded that the demos receive the political representation that the Republic has promised and failed to deliver. In Hong Kong, police beat a man dressed in a yellow raincoat and claimed later that they thought that they were merely kicking a yellow object. The global spread of COVID-19 across the world in early 2020 put a halt to many of these protests, both because the virus posed legitimate health concerns and because it was a useful excuse to punish certain groups of people from assembling in public. Since then, every government in the world has oscillated wildly between governing poorly with incompetence and governing well with malevolence. And so we might push further, I think. What the combination of the global protests and the global pandemics reveal is that the state no longer has people at all. It only has yellow objects, yellow vests, cockroaches, essential workers, and bodies to shoot at. The Hong Kong police were not, in some crucial way, lying. Yellow objects may be kicked, tear-gassed, shot, neglected, and policed. So this does not reveal, I think, the state's inability to represent its people. It reveals its unwillingness to. The Hong Kong protests have received the most widespread and sympathetic media coverage in the North Atlantic world, most likely because they are an easy alibi for democracies that have been rather busy eradicating their own demos. This is why I think it's important to be especially wary of Americans who cheer Hong Kongers for demanding democracy while calling for greater police control over Black populations in the US, or of CCP representatives who tweet, "I can't breathe, Black Lives Matter," while calling Hong Kong protesters cockroaches in need of being smashed. People who reduce humans to objects in one place will almost certainly do it somewhere else soon enough. As the sun sets here and the days begin in the US over the past week, it has been difficult to tell at first glance whether the images of tear-gassed protesters and bloodthirsty police officers were from Hong Kong or from Minneapolis. To stand with Hong Kong is to stand with Black protesters across the US and vice versa. This is not simply, I think, about pious solidarity. It is about an intertwined, or in Lisa Lowe's words, intimate history. The abolition of the slave trade across the British Empire in 1834, followed by the US in 1863, rendered Hong Kong one of the primary ports for the movement of men from China to North America to work as coolie labor. In other words, when objects became humans in the Atlantic world, humans were forced to turn themselves into objects in the Pacific world. In the second half of the 19th century, official British policy in the West Indies was, as Christopher Taylor has written, neglect. In British-owned Hong Kong, neglect was something of an accidental policy. In the Caribbean, freedom meant being forgotten. In Hong Kong, freedom meant being able to sell yourself into bondage or to have the empire forget that it forgot you. But the history of Black people in the US is a lesson that neglect and attention are really opposites. Predominantly Black neighborhoods in North American cities are neglected and policed with equal force. The fear that Hong Kong will become, quote, just another Chinese city, and likely a second tier one at that, is not simply about xenophobia or localist pride, though it does bear those traces. Hong Kong's future under the PRC promises to be one where negligence and vigilance are delivered with equally destructive force, ensuring an island of yellow objects and cockroaches. Over 3 waves from 1918 to 1920, the Spanish flu pandemic killed around 2,000 people on Hong Kong Island. Nearly all deaths occurred at Tung Hua Hospital, charged with treating predominantly ethnically Chinese patients. In contrast, very few deaths occurred at the Civil Hospital, later Queen Mary Hospital, which treated Europeans and Indians who lived on or above Bonham Road. The excess mortality rate in Hong Kong Island was around 0.5%. During the same 2-year period, in paranoid response to growing anti-colonial activism, the British Raj in South Asia implemented more severe laws regulating sedition, subversion, free assembly, and terrorism across its territory. This included, in 1919, opening fire on a peaceful gathering at Jallianwala Bagh, killing at least 400 people. For a variety of reasons, the Raj took an active non-intervention policy regarding the Spanish flu. So from 1918 to 1920, the excess mortality rate in British India was 4.5%, almost 9 times higher than in Hong Kong. The CDC's COVID-19 excess mortality rate data in the US from January to mid-May is still tentative, but the current excess mortality rate for non-Hispanic white people is 0.0003%, and it is 0.0026% for non-Hispanic Black people. Again, that's the same ratio, 9 times higher. The analogy isn't perfect, but I hope you allow me some slight poetic license. I'm in a comparative literature department. During these 2 pandemics, a century apart, imperial states have governed some parts of their population poorly, while governing some parts of their population quite well. The British Empire's policy of inattention in Hong Kong in 1920 meant that many people died, and it laid the groundwork for many more people to die. In 2020, the US government's incompetence will produce an extraordinary number of unnecessary deaths. That is governing poorly, and it is bad enough. In 2020, the CCP is killing Uyghurs and arranging the deaths of many Hong Kong citizens. In the US, white representatives and self-appointed white representatives of the state can kill Black people while posing for a photograph. That is governing well, and it is lethal. A state that governs poorly will let you die. A state that governs well will kill you. The art of being poorly governed, as in Hong Kong, is to cultivate a political vocabulary of human survival. The art of being governed well, unfortunately, requires a different vision altogether. It requires a political philosophy, I think, of fugitivity and impossibility, of finding a way out, of finding the only way out, while simultaneously imagining what might exist beyond that exit. This has been an active philosophical project of anti-colonialism throughout the 20th century, It has been a constant project for Black people in the US since their forced arrival, and it is now the urgent project of Hong Kong people. This is not a politics of nihilism or cynicism, which are inappropriate in any case for an emancipatory project, but they're also not a politics of hope and optimism like that which marked many of the political movements in 1968. What is required now, I think, is a pessimism for an impossible politics. Politics can only be the art of the possible for those whose lives are secured by the state, or in other words, only for those who can confidently know that they will live to see the possible attained. Those whose lives are not guaranteed by the state, or those whose lives the state actively expects to end, cannot afford the luxury of such politics. Such people require a politics of impossibility. Frantz Fanon was a theorist of impossibility, or as David Marriott has beautifully argued, a theorist of the abyss. Fanon's psychopolitical writings articulate perhaps the bleakest revolutionary political philosophy. For Black people, the status of the human was an abysmal impossibility. But it also opens up the most emancipatory action. The wretched of the earth could instead endeavor to create a new man from the wretched of the earth. In other words, any tactic, any strategy, any imaginary was up for grabs. This is where we are now. Fanon's impossibilism belonged to the wretched, people who have never been granted the status of the human. Protesters around the world are protesting because they are no longer the demos of their democracies. They have been reduced to objects, sometimes literally yellow objects, and their actions are based on the despair, but perhaps also the emancipation of having already lost. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to open up for quick Q&A. If you'd like to type your question into the chat box. I seem slightly distracted. We don't usually use this format, and there isn't usually so much security in terms of passwords and registration. So I apologize to everybody who may have received multiple Webex updates every time I added someone to the participants list. I guess it sends, but the backstory to that is, we've gotten a lot of strange trolling from right-wing forces from various countries over the last few weeks, which I think, is a huge portion of Daniel's earlier talk about, earlier part of the talk, that the role of bipolarity in thinking about Hong Kong. So Laura wants to ask, your notion of governing poorly has an interesting tension with Foucault.
Yeah, no, I think that's that's true. I mean, I think this is in some ways a Foucauldian line of thought, which is in kind of late Foucault's work about being governed well, being governed poorly, and Foucault's desire to not be governed at all. I mean, I'm hesitant to follow that line through, I think, for a number of reasons, because Foucault's kind of not being governed at all was really a kind of sign on in a really early form with forms of kind of neoliberalism that I think, in retrospect, are not as kind of emancipatory as we maybe wanted them to be when he was thinking that. But I agree. I think this is very much in some ways thinking alongside that kind of Foucauldian project of thinking about how to be governed. But with the idea of trying to think through what that art of being governed poorly or the art of being governed well then produces as a political philosophy, or possible.
A bit of further housekeeping. If anybody wants to ask anonymized questions, again, I'm sorry, I don't usually juggling a bunch of moderation issues at once, but if anybody wants to ask anonymized questions, you can send them to me directly in the chat function. You don't have to send them to everybody, and I will make sure that your question is heard and not anonymized. Part of the discussion that I found interesting, you elaborated on the demographic that seems to be out on the streets and the generational demographic, that the class, ethnic, and component of who seems to be out protesting. And the larger discursive project of how to talk about this the politics of Hong Kong rebellion and protest in its own terms to not be co-opted by outside or weaponized by outside discourses. And I wondered if you could maybe elaborate on that.
Yeah, so I mean, I think one of the huge anxieties is to really kind of make clear that that the Hong Kong protests and revolutions are not some kind of middle class bourgeois complaint. I mean, this is the kind of classic way in which Hong Kong's political activism is constantly kind of bracketed off and disregarded. I mean, I think what you see when you see 1 to 3 million people on the street in Hong Kong is that any kind of attempt to kind of categorize who is protesting will be insufficient. I think there are a number of kind of ways in which you could kind of loosely describe it, but I mean for the most part, right, the protests seek to be anonymous, represent a variety of heterogeneous components, and are very much about a kind of a political commitment to a certain vision of Hong Kong. So the way in which it's been brushed off by some people has been to say that it's simply a middle class protest. I think that's completely incorrect. But I do think it has something to do with the fact that the protesters understand themselves to be loyal to Hong Kong, which is to say, some people can at the very, very bottom of a socioeconomic class can flee if they have to. Some people at the very, very top of an economic class can move to the flats in London, New York, or whatever. But if it is, to the extent in which it is a middle class protest, it isn't one that is about a kind of bourgeois revolution. It actually is something that's quite seriously connected to the locality of Hong Kong.
I mean, so we don't usually see this, I think, in outside media, in the sense that how much you can presume that there is a larger coalition, cross-class coalition, or what it means to be a Hong Konger isn't necessarily ethnic or place-based. That you think it's much more of a broad civic project.
I mean, I think I think what is being kind of seen on the ground is, at least for the people that I've spoken with, is that the question of what Hong Kong should be, might be, what Hong Kong is still up for debate, and that's the process of working through it is particularly particularly a Hong Kong approach to being Hong Kong, right? Wilfred Chan, and I strongly recommend Wilfred Chan's essay last week, where he says, what's been lost is not the sense of protest. What's been lost is not democracy. Hong Kong has never been a democracy. But what's been lost is an open question of what Hong Kong could be, which is a constant kind of debate and discussion on the ground of Hong Kong. What's replaced that is an answer, and I think that's what's so horrifying about the kind of the future that Hong Kong faces.
Great. We have a question here. In psychology, there's usually talk about how laws are more likely to be followed when something about the legal system is perceived as legitimate. How do you think Hong Kong fits with that, in concert or contradiction? Can there be peace in an illegitimate system?
That's a somewhat complicated question in the case of Hong Kong, where there has been, where Hong Kong's politics are it's liberalism without democracy, capitalism without democracy, and so the kind of forms of political legitimization are less, I think, clear under basic law, simply by virtue of the kind of way it's constructed. I think what that opens up is a really interesting way of thinking about what politics are and kind of at their edges as they intersect with economics and so on. But but I mean, a crisis of legitimacy is in some ways a kind of different concern for how Hong Kong is thinking about its politics. I would think, or how Hong Kong might think about its politics at this juncture.
Right, we've got a private comment question. Can you comment on the role of provocateurs in the protest? Are there, infiltrators? Are there authentic protesters as well who might advocate for violence?
I can't. I mean, I think like any kind of large-scale leaderless protest movement, precisely the point of a leaderless egalitarianism is that you risk inviting people you don't want to. But I mean, as to the validity, I don't know. I think there's been a lot of debate as to whether some violence is coming from pro Hong Kong protesters or agents sent to provoke. That remains, and to mine, I mean, I think that remains very unknown in some kind of general sense. I imagine each one of these gets sorted out differently. I mean, so I think if there are kind of missteps, I mean, one of the things I've been most impressed about the Hong Kong protests since 2019 is that if there have been kind of open missteps, it's been a very self-reflexive and self-correcting and self-interrogative protest movement. And so in that sense, as at the largest scale, I think the protests have been actually quite amazing at really thinking about the stakes of what the methods and tactics and strategies might be.
So we've got a question here. How does being governed well or poorly intersect with critiques of state policing or the call for police abolition? The critique that instead of providing, let's say, education or healthcare, the state criminalizes and polices the poor, as it does people of color in the United States. There is an idea here in terms of making a distinction between different modes of governing, biopolitical, disciplinary power, rather than, what governing means. Your thoughts on this?
No, I think, and that's one of the kind of issues I've bracketed off. I mean, I think this mostly because of the kind of discussions I'm not particularly excited about with have reemerged around the kind of coronavirus and biopolitics. I think those from Agamben to Zizek have been actually quite disappointing and frustrating to read. But I think one way of thinking from the point of view of Hong Kong at this moment, right, is to think about a way in which there could be a form of autonomy that provides, the kind of welfare systems that would be in place and would prevent, presumably, policing of certain communities, like communities of color, like in the U.S., right? And so, in the sense that I'm using it here, I'm using it sort of precisely, narrowly, right, to say that governing well is about a specific form of attention and malevolence, right, which we see enacted in the U.S. on Black populations, and which the CCP potentially poses in Hong Kong in the same way, right? And I think that's the connection that I think has to be drawn between these simultaneous protests. Is the kind of the critique of police force in the U.S. has to be connected to a kind of pro Hong Kong stance in Hong Kong.
That leads us to our next question. And I just want to say for those who are tuning in, when I reached out to Daniel about this topic a month ago, a little over a month ago, the concern was that laws or security measures would be passed as people were social distancing. And here we are now, in which the US is on the cusp of martial law, and Carrie Lam is going to Beijing tomorrow, and people are ever more out in the streets than they were 5 weeks ago. The world is a different place. And so given that, next question is, given the current protests in the US and around the world against police brutality and law enforcement, would you say there is a level of international solidarity we see today that maybe didn't exist before?
I hope so. I mean, and one thing that I think anti-colonialism from Fanon, from even the early 20th century to now, I think has always been about imagining a world free of colonialism. So it's not about Fanon was not interested in decolonizing certain parts of the world. He was interested in decolonizing all of the world, and I think I think that in some ways what the Hong Kong protesters have thought. I strongly recommend reading online publications like La Sun, where there's been a lot of rigorous thought about what it means to think about a particular form of Hong Kong anti-colonialism that is in solidarity with people around the world and is in solidarity against police brutality and against a particular type of violent and malevolent law enforcement. So I think so I think that has always been the role of anti-colonialism across the global South or the Third World or the colonized world. And I think that's why it's so exciting to see to put Hong Kong protests in that conversation, in that ongoing conversation about a kind of truly global solidarity, a vision of global solidarity that I think always gets that tends to be regulated and perpetually gets regulated to being local or myopic or pragmatic. I think Hong Kong protesters are really thinking about what the world would look like, from a pro Hong Kong stance, and that's not solely local.
The next question comes in terms of news accounts have pretty much proclaimed the death of Hong Kong. What do you see as the next steps for protesters under the new laws?
Yeah, this was a popular headline last week. I think the kind of so-called death of Hong Kong, and there are a few kind of eulogy type pieces written. I'm not entirely. I think the way that gets framed is not entirely productive, and that tends to produce a kind of nihilism. I do think, however, what is necessary and what the protests have shown, actually from very early on, is a certain type of pessimism that nevertheless remains quite productive. It's not. So it's not nihilism. But it's not optimism either. But a kind of clear-eyed pessimism that renders, it makes a certain type of emancipation thinkable. So in the sense, the kind of the last week's headlines were about the death of Hong Kong. I think it would not be wise to think of that in kind of nihilistic or cynical terms, but rather to think of it as another way that we have to think about political solidarity, emancipation, moving forward.
I don't see any other questions at the moment, so I wanted to ask, in terms of thinking about that as long-term struggle, long-term project, and there are different chapters to revolution and to resistance. So you mentioned earlier that the question is, for most anti-colonial projects, at least when I think about post-colonial projects, the goal was to get power, separation, and independence, and then the question historically has been to fill in the gaps afterwards, right? In terms of substantively, now what do we do in terms of governing? And so you're earlier when you said Hong Kong, what is the question of what could be? And I wonder if you could elaborate on, what are some of the more concrete platforms or aside from demands about what protesters don't want, what that larger vision could be. What are some of those visions that are being put forward of what Hong Kong would be or could be?
So I think when I think about a kind of history of anti-colonialism or anti-colonial thought from from Gandhi to the present, say, as an arbitrary kind of bracketing off. I mean, what it seems to me is that the kind of mode of anti-colonial thought in its most vibrant traditions has been the reverse, right? It's to think the world beyond colonialism and in some ways to work backwards. I mean, so it's to kind of to imagine that what that world would be in its kind of least pragmatic shape. And in fact, the most kind of really outstanding, anti-Western, non-Western, global South thinkers, right, were greatly disappointed by national independence, precisely because it wasn't post-colonial, right? It wasn't properly anti-colonial, and I think that imagination, I think, is really what it's not pragmatic. It's wildly utopian. Fanon remains, even in his abysmal thought, wildly utopian. It's pessimistic, but it's utopian. And so, and Fanon is someone who's thinking very seriously about the tragedies of thinking pragmatically, of nation building. And someone like, take another example, quite off the top of my head, Gandhi is someone who was very disappointed in 1947 about Indian independence. So, I mean, for me, the kind of exciting thing about anti-colonial thought is its disappointment with simply replicating forms of imperial sovereignty, European nation states, and that has been, in some ways, that's been the greatest disappointment of the 20th century, is that all of these vibrant theories of what political community could be, nevertheless collapsed into thinking very pragmatically at the end. And so, I mean, this makes me not a particularly pragmatic thinker, nor a particularly good thinker of pragmatic revolutions, but pragmatic anti-colonialism. But I think what needs to be kind of foregrounded, even as that might be the case, is the kind of extent to which anti-colonial thought, from the 20th century to the 21st century, has been actually very, very prolific in producing a new imaginary for the world, and as political theory, which it rarely gets to become. And so, I mean, in that sense, I mean, that's what's so exciting about the Hong Kong protests, but that's also what's been so frustrating in some ways, is that they've been relegated to, only being pragmatic, when in fact they are, they're enunciating some, incredibly vivid and vibrant political theory for what a world is, or what a world should be, with Hong Kong as the starting point.
It's a very optimistic note for very turbulent times. All right, last question. How best could we simultaneously criticize the oppressive hyper-capitalism of Hong Kong as well as the oppressiveness of the CCP regime?
I think that those have to be thought together, right? I mean, I think that it's not particularly. I mean, it is absolutely true that Hong Kong has a kind of deregulated capitalism that seems to have that produces and has solidified great inequality, and at the same time, right, it's not clear that that is to be solved in any way. I mean, and so kind of in earlier ways of thinking about this, I mean, it seems, it does seem as though Hong Kong is a bit. It seemed at first glance that Hong Kong is trapped between two very dismal forms of capitalism. One which is the CCPs, and one which is the kind of hyper capitalism that Hong Kong tends to get labeled as. And yet, I think, I mean, the thing that Hong Kong, that especially places like Elam, a recent book, Aftershock, I mean, there's a number of different kind of publications coming out of Hong Kong right now that are actually thinking about a kind of a way in which Hong Kong needn't be trapped between, these kind of two empires, one of capitalism and one of so-called communism. And I mean, that is the project of this kind of Hong Kong anti-colonial movement, I think.
Right. So Any final words or thoughts that you might want to end this for today?
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you very much for putting this together, and thank you everyone for showing up.
So if you can tune in next week, same time, different platform. We'll be on Zoom as regularly scheduled. We'll be hosting Dr. Ethan Davies next week, talking about glacier loss, climate change, and other forms of crises, followed by the following week with Dr. Rawaida Hamid, talking about flooding in Egypt and Thailand. Please tune in and join us on Twitter, Crisis Studies. Thank you to Dr. Elam today for a very uplifting vision of what could be in rather turbulent times. Thank you.
Thank you.